Buddha Way Dharma Talks.
An important topic and part of the practice within the Buddha Dharma, of course, as you will all know, is compassion. We think we know what that is, and well, perhaps we do. On the other hand, we may benefit from a deeper understanding of how it fits into the whole teaching of the Buddha Dharma. So I'm going to say something about that. I'd like to talk about compassion in relation to its depth, looking at it in a deeper way, and also its extent, that is, pushing it out further than we normally would. So both its width, if you like, and its depth. First of all, a kind of intuitive understanding of what we mean by compassion, which I think you will all accept, is that it is identifying with the suffering or pain or distress of others. Of course, when we suffer something ourselves, then we're very much aware of it, and we will see it as something negative to be pushed away, and we have many strategies for doing that, such as blaming someone else, blaming the state of the world, perhaps even blaming ourselves, feelings of regret or frustration, or put it down to illness. There's not necessarily a great deal of learning in that. We all have a strong tendency to objectivize, and that is to find the cause for everything that we find difficult in the world outside, rather than looking into ourselves and whether we can actually learn from our experiences of life and accept its reality and make changes within our understanding and in our attitude. Compassion is quite a trial and a test for us, really, because it is about letting go of one's own ego, and when one is unhappy, when one is suffering, when one is tired, when one is tested by others or by circumstances, that is an opportunity to actually let go of the ego and understand that whatever it is that I'm suffering from, this is human suffering. This is not my suffering. This is human suffering. Every time I'm unhappy, I should say to myself, this is the unhappiness of a sentient being. Any sentient being will feel this way. Perhaps underlying all my feelings is a feeling of dissatisfaction. And of course there will be joyful and happy moments, and we see that even with other creatures around us. When the bird is singing in spring, obviously you can tell by its whole demeanor that it's joyful. However, when it's in the midwinter, can't find anything to eat, and it's sitting there on the fence at 0 degrees Celsius with the rain pouring down, it doesn't look like a very happy creature at all. And in its own little way, it is suffering. All creatures suffer. So we have to perhaps work on letting go of suffering being my suffering. You could say that that's the whole teaching. The whole teaching is letting go of suffering being mine. That I am the one that's suffering. Now we have a cacophony of voices, all crying, sobbing, feeling dismay, because they're all locked into themselves and feeling this is my suffering. Why me? Why me? Well, there is no answer to why me, because it's not just me. It's a feature of life, of being alive, of being here at all. So, but I'm not saying it's just a case of just putting up with that. You might say that is what a life is about, that what life is about is learning from what it's trying to teach us. And if we suffer, if we are feeling distress, unhappiness, dissatisfied, then there are lessons in that, and that is what life could be about, learning from that and moving on from it in the sense of becoming wiser having a deeper enjoyment of life, not a shallow enjoyment of life, doing more for others, being with others, and therefore being less destructive, less harmful. And at the moment, we hear a lot about tsunamis. But in fact, we are living in a human tsunami at the moment. A human tsunami of ignorance and destruction, which is spread around the entire planet. And you can't even imagine what suffering could be ahead for children, or grandchildren, or great-grandchildren, as a result of our current ignorance and refusal to learn from what life actually teaches us. When we speak of compassion, then, we are speaking about subduing the ego and identifying with others. And whatever I find in myself is what I will find in others. The other teaching, of course, is around loving kindness. That is positive, that is saying, give, be generous, be helpful. Compassion, in a sense, is somewhat negative in that it's saying, identify with the downside of life, the unhappy part of it. So when I feel that teaches me that is an element of life, and that is in everyone. And not only in everyone, but in every sentient being. So compassion is very central to the Buddha's teaching. The reason that it's central is that it's connected with ego. The bigger my ego, the more I, me, mine that I construct myself from, the more I'm likely to be dissatisfied, disappointed, frustrated, angry, and demanding. The more I can subdue the ego, let go of the ego, the less demanding I will be, the more generous I will be, the more peaceful I will be, the more I will enjoy equanimity. And maybe there is nothing greater in life than that. What are we looking for? What are we expecting from life? When we get the things that we want, are we any happier? Maybe we're trying to get the wrong things. So compassion is very central because it's about letting go of one's own ego and identifying with the human condition, in this case, the negative side of it. Loving kindness is more about the positive side to it, which we'll come to again in another talk. Now, let's think about the depth of this. We might, in a superficial way, take compassion to be simply understanding that someone is sick, ill, up against some misfortune, lost their job, being threatened with losing their job, whatever. We understand that. We think, right, that's very sad, isn't it? That's very sad. Now, what we are doing, perhaps, here is not a bad thing at all, but it is, in fact, I would describe as pity rather than compassion. And pity and compassion are related. Pity is shallow, not bad, but shallow, and compassion is deep. Pity is shallow. Why? Why is it shallow? I'm not saying it's to be rejected, but it's shallow in the sense it doesn't go deep. And it doesn't go deep because the ego is still involved. When I pity someone, it's as though I'm okay, I'm protected, I'm not suffering what you're suffering. And perhaps it makes me slightly afraid to think that I could suffer as you are suffering. So I feel pity for you, but it's tainted, it's tinged with fear, and perhaps even a slight feeling of superiority, like, I'm okay, you're sick, how unfortunate, I'll bring you a bunch of flowers, this is a good thing, but we need to go a little deeper than that. I'm not trying to give the impression that pity is a bad thing. I'm trying to say that it's, if you like, the first level. A deeper level requires that the ego be subdued. Pity involves the ego to some extent. I know we're just playing with words here. I'm just trying to make a distinction. We don't have to take the words too seriously, because we might sometimes use the word pity to mean compassion, and we might use the word compassion to mean pity. So what I'm trying to get across is that compassion is very much tied up with the whole process of the Buddha Dharma, of what we learn in mindfulness, self-awareness of our own states of mind, all working towards subduing the ego to be at one with everything and not think that there's something out there that we can manipulate and exploit and which we destroy in the meantime. So compassion is when, if you like, my ego is dissolved in the whole ocean of humanity or of being. That it is intrinsically turbulent, it is intrinsically dissatisfying to any thing that tries to separate itself and see itself as living in isolated glory. So the only way forward is actually to subdue the ego and to identify with the dissatisfaction and frustration of others, and to see that that is in the nature of things. But it is more, if you like, in the nature of things, the more I misunderstand it. The only release from it is to subdue the ego. Then I develop equanimity as well as compassion. Equanimity and compassion actually go together, as insight and compassion go together. And actually the other value here is altruistic joy, and that is feeling good about someone else feeling good, if you see what I mean. Feeling good about someone else having an insight, learning how to develop equanimity. All of that also brings a deeper level of happiness in other people's happiness. So, compassion, when you think about compassion, think about identifying with the suffering of the other and seeing that their suffering comes from attachment to their ego, which is a very natural thing. And that you too are struggling with your ego. And when you see that their suffering comes from struggling with their ego, you will see that so does yours. And then as you manage to subdue the ego to any extent, you will see that your previous suffering was unnecessary, and you will also see that the suffering of others is unnecessary. And that really is compassion. Because there's nothing more touching than realizing that the suffering of someone else is unnecessary. It doesn't have to be there. So that is the depth of compassion in the Buddhist teaching. What about the extent of it? Well, again, we can look at this in a kind of shallow or preliminary way, and we can look at it in a deeper way. Of course, if your loved one is suffering, you're likely to feel quite deeply for them, because you have that love for them, you will identify with their suffering. But what about the next door neighbor? What about a distant relative? What about people you don't know? What about people that live in distant lands, that look different, that dress differently, that speak different languages? People that perhaps we don't understand because their culture seems to be barrier to our understanding. Can we accept that they too are suffering in the way that we suffer? Can we relate to that? Or does it make us feel afraid that that's not something I can manage? And then, of course, in the Buddha's teaching, we go even further than that. That little bird sitting on the fence, freezing in the winter, not so different from me, actually. Might extend it to everything, all the way down to earthworms or beyond. When you see an earthworm has popped up from the grass in the rain and sets off across the grass and decides to cross the path, and then the sun comes out. And then the path dries up, and the earthworm is left in the middle of the path and can't move. When you see that, are you going to pick it up and put it back on the grass? Or will you notice it at all? Or will you say to yourself, it's just an earthworm? On the other hand, you might think, well, actually, I can see what's going on there. I feel a little bit like that myself sometimes. Everything drying up around me, unable to move. That sense of dryness, immobility. Why not get a little twig, pick it up and put it back on the grass? It's good for you and good for the earthworm. Good for the soil and good for the vegetables that grow in the soil. And so it goes on. This seems to be quite a big demand on one, really. Buddha Dharma is saying, to be compassionate for anything and everything. Is that actually possible? I could spend my whole day picking up earthworms. I could go out with a little van painted "Earthworm Rescue Team" on the side, looking for stranded earthworms and rescuing them. Well, it does sound amusing, but on the other hand, people do rescue birds when they're covered in oil. They rescue a hedgehog that's got a broken leg due to a car passing by. And we just push it a little bit further. Actually, it's not such a silly idea, is it? Look at the money we put into things. How many billions is it going to be to find out that Mars is uninhabitable? It doesn't have an atmosphere, doesn't have liquid water. You'll die in minutes from cosmic radiation, and yet we're putting billions into wandering about on the surface. Meanwhile, we mess up our own planet. Now, what if we put several billions into all of us having earthworm rescue teams? Now that seems crazy, doesn't it? That does seem crazy. Going to Mars, of course, that's not crazy. Now, from the point of view of the Buddha Dharma, actually, thousands of earthworm rescue teams makes a lot more sense than trying to go to Mars, or all the other very strange things that we put huge effort into, which I won't even begin to enumerate, otherwise we'll be here all day. It's about lack of perspective in human life, huge lack of perspective with destructiveness at the bottom of it. So the Buddha Dharma tries to restore some perspective, ask us to think deeply about things. What is this life about? Is there another way of living together which is more compassionate? So, okay, you can't spend the whole day rescuing earthworms, but you can spend the whole day with a compassionate attitude and with the wisdom which tells you, okay, I can't rescue every earthworm, but if I come across one, I'll pick it up and move it on. It's what you encounter is important. Everything you encounter is the measure of where you stand, not all the things you don't encounter. Of course, we can do things for people who are less fortunate than ourselves in other countries, because we do know about them now, and we do, in a sense, encounter them. But if we were all paying greater attention to all those that we do encounter, the person that comes into your office you've never seen before, the person who asks you for a favour, the person who asks you for directions, all those people that you encounter during the week, they're all opportunities. See it all as a test. Every time that you have an encounter, whether it's with the Prime Minister or an earthworm, and there is a difference, then think about, see that as a test. What is this asking of me in terms of the Buddha Dharma teachings? What is it asking of me in terms of helpfulness, etc.? Of course, we know that, to be realistic, there are also people who you encounter who have little wisdom, little compassion, and in fact may be very harmful people. And then compassion comes in there too, because there are individuals who want to hurt others and even derive their own form of satisfaction from hurting others. There are people out there who have no mercy at all. How does one relate to them from a compassionate point of view? Well, first of all, be very careful. Be very careful, but it doesn't mean to say that you don't have a compassionate understanding of them. Who knows what they have suffered? Who knows what wrong paths they've taken in their lives? Who knows what miseries and horrors they may have suffered themselves? Who knows what darkness and misery they actually live in their minds and hearts? And that is why they are the way they are. They are dangerous to you, but they are the way they are because of the horrors of their life. So that will also make us cautious, but not want to harm that person as a result. And of course, we have a society in which vengefulness, punishment, revenge are taken for granted. With people who are very dangerous, it may be that they do need to be put aside, not to harm people, but they shouldn't be abandoned and they shouldn't be punished. We need to protect ourselves from them, but we also need to help them, insofar as that is our compassionate duty. May not always work, but you see, all of that business about punishment, that's the refusal to learn, isn't it? It's so much easier to punish and to learn from what one encounters in life. If you hurt me, then I'm going to hurt you. There's no learning in that. You hurt me, well, how do I feel about that? What state of mind are you in that you want to hurt me? Now I'm learning. That's compassion. Always identifying on a deeper level with the suffering, the frustration, the bewilderment, the uncertainty, the fear that all sentient beings do feel in their lives. It might seem like a tall order, but what's the alternative? The alternative is to live in ignorance and go on as we are, being self-destructive and being destructive. Because that is the alternative. We either rise to the occasion of being compassionate, or we remain in ignorance and find shortcuts, easy solutions, quick fixes, reactions, anger, the rest of it, which is even worse, infinitely worse, than making the effort to develop compassion. So compassion, to conclude, is not an optional extra in the Buddha's teaching. It is at the heart of the Buddha's teaching, the very heart of the Buddha's teaching. You can't meditate and feel a little better, perhaps, and then feel I've taken something. I've taken something. I've got something extra, which is good for my ego. Before I was a stressed out ego. Now I'm a peaceful ego. Doesn't really make sense. There's no such thing as a peaceful ego. Meditation and compassion, they go together. They're one and the same thing. They're working together. So it's not as though you can meditate and I'll think about whether I'm going to be compassionate or not. That makes no sense. If you really understand compassion, you understand the whole of the Buddha's teaching. And it's not a matter just of understanding, of course. It's a matter of change of attitude. It's a matter of living your life in a different way.
New Buddha Way approaches meditation as a way of life, letting go of East and West, past and future, and starting afresh here and now. To find out more, visit www.newbuddhaway.org.